Hi everyone, my name is Lara Spirit and I am the Red Box reporter at The Times, and I am delighted to be moderating this conversation tonight about one of the most fascinating figures of 20th century British political history, and one who I'm excited to discuss whether or not has a number of lessons and parallels to teach us about our contemporary politics today. And I'm all the more excited about who will be joining us for that discussion tonight too. So very grateful to Nick Thomas-Symonds, who has of course written a fantastic book on Harold Wilson, but is also a renowned frontbench Labour politician, currently Shadow Secretary for International Trade, and also to be joined by Glen, who is a professor at Oxford Brookes and is also a writer on Wilson and on the Labour Party, and is currently writing a book about the domestic politics of the Blairs. So I'm sure everybody who's on this call will agree that we are very well equipped to have a conversation like the one that we're going to attempt to have tonight. And I would love to kick off, if possible, by asking Nick to speak a bit to the kind of basic points around the character of Harold Wilson for those who might not know, and for what he can teach us potentially about the politics of today. But perhaps we'll just start a bit about the life of Harold Wilson and a kind of brief overview of his political career. And I should say to those who are here that there'll be a link in the chat, if it's not already there, shortly to Nick's book, which of course I've got right here, and I would definitely recommend reading for those who haven't had the joys of trawling through the long and very fascinating political career and life indeed of Harold Wilson. But Nick, if you could just hello, and if you could just speak a little bit perhaps to the character that we're going to be delving into tonight, that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much, Lara, and it's fantastic to be joining Progressive Britain this evening, and to be joining Glen, for whom I've got such great admiration as an academic and historian. And it's wonderful as well to have so many of you joining us this evening. I was just going to give a little bit of background about Harold before Glen says a few things, and then we launch into the discussion which Lara is going to chair. So Harold Wilson was born on the 11th of March 1916 in the Colne Valley, which is 3 miles southwest of Huddersfield, and Huddersfield is where there is a statue of Harold today outside the train station. He went to the local New Street Elementary School, where he was a brilliant pupil, and then on to Royds Hall Grammar School. And indeed, he was the first post-war Prime Minister to have been to a grammar school. And in my book, I pick out what I think are two really important aspects of his background to remember when we're discussing his politics in a moment or two. Firstly, his father was what I suppose we'd call today an industrial chemist, worked in the munitions industry in World War I, but also in what was known then as the dyestuffs industry. And the problem is that both industries were cyclical. When demand was high, his father, Herbert Wilson, did well and was able, for example, they moved, his wife Ethel, Harold, and his sister Marjorie moved to a bigger house when things were going well. But when things were going badly, his father often ended up unemployed, and Harold never forgot speaking to his father and asking for money, and only to be told by his father, "I'm very sorry, son, but I don't have the money to give you." And that really did have an impact on Harold in terms of his abhorrence of unemployment and high unemployment as a social evil, which runs through his career. The second part of his background, which I think is so crucial, is the nonconformist aspect, the congregationalist aspect. And that isn't to say that the moral dimension to Harold's politics in somehow made him pious or thought he was on some sort of moral high ground. But when he said in his 1962 conference speech, "The Labour Party is a moral crusade or it is nothing," he really did mean it. Harold was to go on in 1934 to Oxford University, had a stunning degree, and then under the recommendation of the great William Beveridge, became not just a tutor at Oxford University at the age of 21, but also was recommended to join the wartime civil service, where he was a brilliant civil servant, combining photographic memory, command of detail, but also a real practical sense of what the decisions that he made based on numbers had on the outside world. He was then, partially through some of the links he'd made in wartime with the coal mining unions, became the MP for what was then the Ormskirk constituency. He thrived as a minister under Clem Attlee, Parliamentary Secretary at the Ministry of Works, Secretary for Overseas Trade, President of the Board of Trade until he resigned with Aneurin Bevan and John Freeman in 1951. With Labour in opposition between 51 and 64, he became a really prominent frontbencher, Shadow Chancellor, Shadow Foreign Secretary, and then was elected leader in 1963, in which year he made the speech, perhaps for which he's most remembered, the White Heat of Technology speech on the 1st of October 1963. And Glen and I will, I'm sure, be talking in a moment about the impact of his two governments of 1964 to 70 and 1974 to 6. But my central argument in the book is that the low reputation he gained after leaving office, whether from the controversial resignation on as the Lavender List, and the fact that his legacy was defined against by Margaret Thatcher and then later neglected, that what we need to see is him as a politician who did a great deal that shaped modern Britain. And I look forward to discussing that in the course of the next 50 minutes.
Thank you very much for that. That was a a brilliant synopsis of the long life of Harold Wilson in that respect. And Glen, I suppose it'd be useful if you could maybe speak now to why it is that you think we might be talking about Harold Wilson today. What is it about this particular political figure that Nick has just described that makes him kind of such a fruitful topic of discussion for those who are interested in British politics?
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. And I'm interested to and looking forward to talking about this topic. So I can endlessly talk about Harold Wilson. So don't let me bore on about Harold Wilson too much every time you ask me a question. I think that there's always a tendency when parties look like they might form a government, and unfortunately for Nick, you might have to be a Secretary of State. That they look back and they look at some of the kind of the mulch and the fruitful ground that's happened before. So Labour, of course, today is thinking about 1960, 63, 64, when Wilson sort of carried all before him as a relatively youthful, dynamic leader of the opposition, and a kind of feeling of a new man, a grammar school man, a technically educated man who was very good with stats, very good with maths, something that was always part of his identity. And also we look back at 94, or maybe 1992 to 1997, when John Smith and Tony Blair seemed to carry all before them as well, and looked like John Smith would have been Prime Minister and Tony Blair did become Prime Minister. So it's no accident, I think, that Keir Starmer says, who's your favourite Labour leader? And he says, well, Harold Wilson. I mean, he partly has to say that because he can't say Tony Blair, and he doesn't want to say Clement Attlee because it's boring. So you have to pick someone else. But I think it is particularly apposite at a time when there is going to be very little money around for a Labour government. It's going to be in straitened and difficult economic times. It may not have a majority. I'd probably put money on that, but if I was a gambling man, which I'm not, and all these things are true of the Wilson period. So when Wilson won in October 64, he had a majority of only 3. He had to come back 2 years later to try and gain a bigger majority. And the same was the case in 1974. Didn't have a majority in Feb, had to come back in October and gained a very thin majority. And Labour faces some of these challenges now. So, for instance, what do you do when you don't have that much money to spend? Wilson didn't have much money to spend because he couldn't annoy the markets. See Liz Truss' example. He couldn't annoy the currency markets, in his case, not the bond markets. And when Callaghan raises pensions in November 1964, he sets off one of many sterling crises, because sterling's not allowed to move against the dollar. It's fixed against the dollar, and that causes the government to have to cut spending and rein back, much like Liz Truss had to rein back on her tax cuts. But if you look at any, I'll stop on this point. If you look at any area of public policy, that there are echoes of the Wilson era. So in my kind of bailiwick universities, Wilson inherited a massive expansion of universities up from the Robbins report in 1962, which has recommended many more new universities to be founded. And he took the ball with that and really went with that, but in a way that didn't cost as much as it might have done. And similarly, Labour's going to be faced with what it does about tuition fees if it comes back to power in 18 months' time, which seemingly can't rise in cash terms. They seem to be fixed in cash terms, but of course costs rise all the time. So the real unit of resource, this is not a plea for money, the real unit of resource declines. So I think my answer would be, it feels quite Wilsonian, this moment. And of course, Keir is a little bit Wilsonian himself, in that he comes from the left and moves to the right, for instance. He tries to hold together a very vociferous party, for instance. He feels a little bit like that technocratic Mr. Wilson that we know from Nick's book.
Interesting. So, I mean, I'm definitely keen to talk about the parallels, or the limitations of the parallels with Keir Starmer at some point, if we may. But I'm interested, Nick, in what you think, particularly about what Glen just touched on there, particularly about the inheritance deal that Wilson faced when he first came in as Prime Minister. And of course, we were just talking then about Theresa May, but obviously she said she had more in common with Wilson than she realized, but she absolutely didn't. What she doesn't have in common is the ability to go back to the electorate and to do so successfully, which of course Wilson was notorious for being able to do. But in that first time when he comes in, he's got that very slim majority. He's coming off the back of that, in many ways, Dash for Growth budget that we've heard a lot about recently, in light of the conversation around Kwasi Kwarteng's kind of similar in some respects kind of political pitfalls with regards to that fiscal moment. But I'm interested in how comparable you think that kind of moment was for Wilson. Of course, you have the economic inheritance, but you also have a time of kind of rapid social change and some fascinating debates around some social issues that many people have drawn parallels with today. How useful do you think that period of Wilson coming in is to think about today, with regard both to the current political context, but also if you think ahead, to a possible Labour government should it win in 2024?
Yes, and Lara, I do think this is an instructive period for us, just as I agree with what Glen has said about the mid-1990s as well. I think both of these periods have lessons for us at the present time. I do fear, on the economic point, that the inheritance of 2024 may well be worse than the inheritance of 1964. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, not least if you look at the condition that our frontline public services in. If you look at the Office of Budget Responsibilities growth forecasts that were published with the most recent budget, they've been downgraded. Growth is sclerotic, to say the least. So I think we're going to be in possibly a more difficult situation than Wilson inherited 60 years before. But I also think there are, and I'm not going to just make the glib 13 wasted years observation, though I could, as Wilson did in 1964, and the current situation we find ourselves in today. But I was recently, when Keir Starmer started his 5 mission speeches, I actually did read the speeches that Harold Wilson produced. They were principally designed for Alec Douglas Hume to call an election in May 1964. He didn't oblige, by the way, and went to the October. But I was fascinated by the series of speeches that Wilson made and the observations he made about the inequalities in Tory Britain, the lack of opportunity, the need for additional skills and to deal with the skills gap. And I was fascinated by how many of the challenges he identified from the 13 years of Conservative rule were quite easily transferable to the critique that we make of the moment, at the moment of the Conservatives' 13 years. I also think it's a moment of change. There's local elections going on at the moment. I was in Plymouth on Saturday, actually, and the number of people who just say to you almost as a reflex, we've just had enough of the Conservatives, it's time for a change, that comes up a great deal, which is clearly comparable. But also just speaking for a moment as a front bencher, and I'm fascinated by what Harold did in 63, 64. And remember, he faced an even higher mountain than the one we currently face, because the Conservatives won with a majority of 100 in 1959, which he overturned in he and Hugh Gaitskell overturned in a parliament, whereas we're trying to overturn a majority of 80. But I think what Wilson combined was that vision, the white heat of technology, the pace of scientific change, and that again, there really are comparisons now. If you think of personalized medicine in our health services, if you think of the AI revolution, which is clearly going to make a huge difference, the sustainability agenda and tackling climate change and green tech, there's a real, if you like, we could transpose the white heat to the green heat, I suppose. But in addition to that, the one thing Harold never lost sight of, and I'll finish on this point, is that the manifesto contained very practical things where people could say, how is my life going to be better under a Labour government? It wasn't just about the vision, important though it was, it had those things in it as well. And I think that's something that, we take very seriously indeed too.
And that's very fascinating. And I mean, if I may also ask, and tell me if this is if this is a bit too facetious, but of course there was that in that vexed early debate around devaluation, there was a very interesting political dilemma in strategic terms facing Wilson for that incoming Labour government, which was the extent to which you blame your predecessors' political failures openly, and the extent to which you move against them in that respect at risk. And obviously Wilson's failure to devaluate for a certain amount of time. In your book, you say the first few opportunities missed defensible, but is there a situation in which Labour comes in perhaps with a slim majority, and the inheritance deal, like you say, might be so bad, worse even than Wilson had, that it will be particularly difficult for a Labour government, and whoever it is around that cabinet table, to be able to take bold political decisions because of the difficulty of disavowing your predecessors in the way that Wilson thought would be a mistake?
Well, I think we do, and we have been saying this. Rachel's been saying this. Keir has been saying this. There are going to be things that we would love to do as a Labour government that we're either going to have to slightly delay, or we are going to have to amend in terms of the way we do it, because fundamentally we need to provide that economic stability. It was the thing that Harold had the challenges with. He eventually devalues the pound in 1967. My view in the book is he should have done that in the summer of 1966. I think it's defensible in the earlier period, but I think that's the moment. He'd won a majority of 100. That's the moment he should have devalued. But I think the lesson to us is going to be from Harold that politics is very much the art of the possible. Politics is about what is realistic for us to do, and we are going to have to be completely realistic and open with the public that due to the state of the public finances, there are things that aren't going to be possible. And I guess that's the less inspirational part of making the argument for change, but it's an important part too.
And Glen, what do you think about that particular theory of change? When you think about the possibility of an incoming Labour government, perhaps with a slim majority, perhaps with a large one, and the possibility of a pretty grim inheritance deal, potentially by way of the economic circumstances, but also, foreign policy, a number of other issues. In what ways do you think Wilson is directly relevant to that calculation?
I think it's very relevant because one of the things that they say when they have that meeting in October 1964 and they decide not to devalue, Callaghan and Brown and Wilson, Jim Callaghan and George Brown and Wilson as Prime Minister, is if you give up one line, you may have to give up another line later. So if you give up the parity of $2.80 to the pound and go to $2.30 or $2.40, next it will be $2. So we may as well try and hold the line to start off with. Well, I think that sounds a little bit like we're going to continue to spend. We might spend more, we might raise more taxes, but some of the spectres that haunt us at the moment, so another banking crisis emerging from the United States, or, God forbid, war over Taiwan, or a wider war over Ukraine, will all face the Labour government with a much worse economic crisis down the line. And of course, Labour in the 60s does get a much worse economic crisis down the line. It gets a gold crisis where the dollar threatens to be devalued as well in 68, just a few months after sterling is devalued. Because you've got to remember the devaluation of sterling and the pressure on sterling are just facets of pressure on the dollar, because the Americans are spending so much money in Vietnam and at the same time attempting to go for guns and butter, attempting the Great Society program at home, that its allied currency, the currency speculators see as its front defense, sterling, is getting hammered all the time because also the Brits can't afford to protect it. So I guess there are two lessons from that. The first is that, like Nick kind of implied there, that, you know, events, dear boy, events will blow you off course. Actually, Harold uses that phrase. We've been blown off course when Callaghan says, you know, steady as she goes in 66, 67. And also that the giving up the first line can still mean you have to give up the next line. So say Labour has to bring in some wants to do some cutting like Blair did straight away in benefits in order to show that it can be tough if there is an economic crisis ongoing. It might still have to do many more of those later down the line. So why do them straight away? Why not store them up? So you need to develop your defences in a way that Wilson did, because he got loans in order to carry him over. Really what Harold thought, I think, in the devaluation dilemma is that he could get over with socialist planning. If he could just get over 3 or 4 years, then his planning measures like the national plan, which would encourage people to grow and to invest, would take hold, and then the pressure would gradually come off sterling. Now, I think the problem with that is a little bit like Labour's problem saying that they're going to increase growth in one parliament, which is that I'm very sceptical that you can increase growth in just 4 or 5 years, because the roots of economic growth are so complex and so deep. I just think the time frame was unrealistic, and that might also be unrealistic for kind of Labour's objectives to be one of the highest growing OECD countries now too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It was a very interesting and very bold commitment. Nick, can I ask, there's a question in the Q&A that I would love your thoughts on from John Newman, which is, what might the 2024 equivalent of the devaluation dilemma be? If you're going to take a punt on what it might be, what do you think it would be?
Well, I think I think Glen has put his finger on this. I think it's most likely to be something to do with international circumstances. I think are likely to be a challenge. And if you think about it next year as well, there's going to be, first of all, there's European parliamentary elections. There'll be a new European Commission. Now, one of the things we want to do as the next Labour government, we've set out our red lines on customs union, single market, but we want to rebuild that relationship. We'll have to see what comes out of that. But there's also, of course, the US presidential election, which obviously we all over progressive Britain want to see the Democrats obviously win, but that could throw up something that really does affect the international order. And I also think as well that if you look around the world, and obviously in my trade brief, this is something I'm doing on a virtual daily basis, meeting people around the world, Britain still has extraordinary soft power, and that's going to be very, very important to us. But you would have to conclude as well, the way the world is as well, that there are democracies around the world, but there's a lot of autocracies as well, some of which are becoming quite unpredictable. And the one thing we've learned from the war in Ukraine and Putin's illegal invasion is that has huge economic effects. It's not, to use another phrase from a past prime minister, somewhere from people from far away, of which we know nothing. Everything that happens affects supply chains. It affects the world economy. And you could see a number of things internationally that would have a huge effect on us here at home.
Interesting. Oh, Glen, I can see that you've
raised my hand using my skilled online teaching skills. After a couple of years of teaching online, I can now raise my hand in Zoom. Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things to that. The first is that, of course, Wilson took big advantage of the peace dividend that he could delve into when he was prime minister, especially in 64 to 70, and especially in 1968 to 1970. So Wilson's the first prime minister that reduces defence spending below education spending, which is a huge change for the British state, which has really been what David Edgerton calls a warfare state. It hasn't been a welfare state. It's been a war-fighting state and an international, an imperial state, until Wilson removes British forces based east of Suez and caps defence spending at £2 billion in cash terms, which gives him a huge amount of money to play with at home. I fear that, unfortunately, a Labour government will not have a peace dividend. In fact, quite the opposite, may have to spend more on defence at the same time as it wants to spend more on, elderly care, social care, like we see in the headlines today. That's the first point. So Nick's right in that there are perhaps even more acute trade-offs now. I think the thing about mentioning the customs union in the single market is, yet again, we've been here before, which is that Wilson tried to build what he called the bridge between EFTA, the EFTA 7 and the EU, the EEC countries, i.e. trying to bring them close together in trade terms. And the EEC simply said no, because these EFTA powers have all got post-imperial hinterlands and cheap food. And the whole point of the EEC is to stop you selling your cheap food to us while we get on with, having a manufacturing customs union. So I think the dilemma that Wilson faced, and which eventually in 1966-67 convinced him that the UK had to join the EEC, is that there are huge limits to how much you can merge the trade deals that the UK is doing now, for instance, CPTPP, with the EEC's insistence on a relatively high tariff wall. They're not insurmountable, but Harold was not by any means a strong European. He simply said, well, we must be in it. We have no choice. So Labour is now faced with this terrible dilemma that lots of people in Labour's ranks would like to join the single market, but they simply can't for electoral reasons, they think. So Harold had some good things that he could, the fair wind at his back, like defence cuts, but he also had challenges like he could join the EEC, which Labour now feels it can't.
Yeah, so Nick, it would be good to get your perspective on this, even if just a historical one and not necessarily a contemporary one. But I mean, in the case of Harold Wilson's relationship with Europe, of course, he was, yes, it was an example of a bitterly divided party, but it was also an example of somebody that could manage a bitterly divided party and do so while winning numerous elections. And so I wonder if for you that's a source of hope. But more specifically, I think Europe's quite a good way to begin talking about what it was about Harold Wilson that made him such a singularly good political strategist in mind, and those various different ways that he navigated the party. Of course, the party looks very different now to what it looked like then, and some of the main political figures and the kind of various machinations at the top table that I'm sure you've seen much of probably little resemble in some respects that. But Europe is a particularly interesting example of one of those rows that just kind of keeps on rumbling, and I wonder if you find that in any way instructive of the kind of politics of the top of the Labour Party then and as it is now.
Well, yes. I mean, you look at every year of Labour politics. Frankly, some of the themes just come back time and time again. And the Labour leader that unites the party always has tremendous political skills, I think. And this issue, this European issue, I think, probably displays this about Harold really in a way that perhaps no other issue does. This one, and there's a part of the book where I interviewed two civil servants, the late Robert Armstrong, indeed Robin Butler, who later went on to be cabinet secretary. I had this story of Harold the day after the 1975 referendum, where he sat there in number 10 and he looks up, and of all newspapers, the Daily Telegraph had said that the result was frankly a triumph for Mr. Wilson. And Harold looked at it and he said, you see, they all say that I've got no sense of strategy. And yet it's taken me the best part of 10 years to achieve this. And even Roy Jenkins, who, very philosophical, pro-European, had broken the whip in 1971 to vote for the piece of primary legislation, the European Communities Act that became the European Communities Act that brought about our accession to the then EEC. Even he later said that although he was really frustrated with Harold at the time, he later said that Harold did actually get this right. And of course, it took some chicanery. He'd never been against it in principle in the way someone like, say, Clement Attlee was. Clement Attlee was completely opposed to it on sovereignty grounds, the whole idea of European integration when the coal and steel community was suggested. Harold was sceptical, but was always careful in his language in the 60s, makes the application to join in 67 that's vetoed by de Gaulle. but then finds himself in opposition, very split party. The left, led by Michael Foot, very opposed. The principally the right of the parliamentary party, that's a bit of an oversimplification. People like John Smith, actually, Roy Jenkins, people like this, passionately in favour of going in. And what does he do in this situation? Well, he comes up with, first of all, he's going to oppose entry, but on the Tory terms, and that second qualification is very important. He gets, I mean, Joe Haynes, his press secretary, tells me great stories about how Harold was deputing him to the National Executive Committee to stop them voting against entry in principle, to keep that qualifier in, to keep some space, political space for himself. And then, of course, he adopts an idea originally suggested by Tony Benn at the NEC in 1971, which Jim Callaghan referred to as the lifeboat into which we may all need to jump one day, of the referendum, then comes back in, renegotiates, gets, and then, of course, secures the referendum result. And I actually think that referendum result is underestimated, firstly because his renegotiation matters. If you look at 2016, David Cameron's renegotiation virtually disappears. It virtually disappears out of the debate. Yeah, Harold's stays part of the debate. His face, his renegotiation is on every single leaflet that goes through a house in Britain. Although, yes, he suspended cabinet responsibility. Yes, he let Benn and Jenkins fight it out. Harold was the one always in control. Harold was the one who, and this is crucial as well, was speaking to the Labour Party voters about this issue. And I think it was critical. And Harold settled the European issue for several decades. He can hardly be blamed for the rise of Euroscepticism in the early part of this century, I think.
Interesting. And I mean, Glenn, I'm wondering what you think about the issue of Europe now, and whether or not,
how long have you got?
Well, I mean, particularly, I think, and for obvious reasons, it's I don't think it's generous to ask Nick to pass judgment on this, but no. I mean, with regards to, Keir Starmer's abilities as a kind of strategic thinker, I think the outline that we just had, the very good one from Nick about the way that Wilson kind of, extremely effectively managed that very delicate political situation in his party, knowing when to let divisions be in public and knowing when to kind of rein them in. Do you think that that is a lesson for Sir Keir Starmer? And how, if you were Keir Starmer, would you think you would handle the kind of, comparable, but obviously, in many respects very different relationship that we have with Europe, and the issue that the kind of responsibility that Labour will have in outlining that position ahead of the next election, and should they win when he's in Downing Street?
Well, I think I'll take that in two parts, if I may, which is the first part is I think there are some easy early wins, depending on what Sunak now does, to move closer to the EU. So you can move closer on veterinary and phyto-veterinary regulation, which makes the Northern Ireland question much easier. So remember, Northern Ireland's economy is a huge amount of farming. You can move closer with Macron's project for a European community, which is wider than the EU, on defence, which is what something else that Blair took the reins of with defence cooperation with the French. You can join Horizon, which I'd quite like them to do, so that us academics can bid for more money. You can rejoin Erasmus, the student, swap scheme for universities, or whatever it is. So there's lots of things you can do. However, what I would say about that is that that's a term one and more of a political strategy. So that's going to keep the Labour Party happy. And remember, Harold said, the Labour Party's fine when you're driving it really, really fast and no one's noticing what's going on and they all feel sick. But as soon as you stop the bus, they'll all get out and start arguing about it. So Starmer has got the ability to do some really good getting closer to the EU moves, which will keep everybody in Labour happy for a couple of years, right? Great. However, I think in terms of economic growth, and Nick doesn't have to answer to this, as you say, I don't think any of that cuts it. For me, the whole reason the UK economy recovered in the 1980s and 90s is not the supply side reform, it's just joining the single market. And the idea that one is going to reform the UK economy without having a Norway kind of solution, is my personal view, is simply not going to be enough. There's not enough productivity gain without that kind of differentiation, specialization. If I can come at the end of that, if I can come back to what made Wilson such a successful politician, I think there are three things that I would say about that. The first is that he's just, what do they call him in that one of the chapters of the Ben Pimlott biography, which I'm sorry, Nick, I also recommend as well as Nick's book.
Not tonight.
And we're not allowed to talk
Names
about any other biographies. There are several, and of course Nick's is the most recent and the best of these. But the one of the chapters is called Rubber Ball, and it's basically just like, you cannot beat this guy. However hard you smash into him, he just keeps coming back at you, and he just keeps going. He's just got these enormous reserves of physical courage and physical energy. And I think there's an emergent literature about the health of senior civil servants and the mental health and physical health of senior civil servants and senior politicians. And quite frankly, being prime minister is just impossible, and bends them all out of shape in the end. Even people as level-headed as Theresa May, for instance, is really, really hard for them to keep going. So he's just got this indefatigability. The second thing I think that helps him govern the Labour Party is that he's not really clearly identified with a clique or a group. So he's not really left. He's not really right. He's not clearly pro-European, as Nick says. He's not clearly anti-European. And therefore, he almost becomes the essential Mr. Wilson. He, in fact, it's him that's the life raft they all have to climb into. because he's the only person who can hold them together. And when you look at Neil Kinnock, for instance, someone else who comes from the left and becomes a revisionist, he also is one of the only people in the mid-80s who stops the Labour Party being destroyed. Someone else who is also full of physical and moral courage, you know, who has to go into these meetings with Militant and get absolutely battered rhetorically and sometimes threatened. So he's got that as well. And lastly, I think Harold's got this, he just has an ordinariness about him that means he understands how, as he would have said in sexist terms, the man in the street feels and thinks and speaks and eats, and the kind of TV he wants to watch, and the kind of football he wants to watch, and the kind of supporting Huddersfield that he wants to do. And that is because he's the man of the moment. He's the guy who went to grammar school. He's the person who invested all this in education, like all of his class. He's the person who makes it, who everything is invested in him, because when his dad has that unemployment crisis, the sisters' exams go off. Marjorie, his sister's exams go off. They put huge store in Harold. He really is. He just looks and sounds and feels like Britain, and that is incredibly. You cannot buy that stuff. It's incredibly powerful.
It's interesting, yeah, Nick. So perfect opportunity, I think, to be able to ask you much the same. What is it about Harold Wilson, in short, that you think made him such a kind of singularly successful politician with such singular appeal? But also, I think that broader question of what actually was his politics, because one of the most fascinating things I think about this was that, or that we were, I think, talking about before, is this kind of question of when Harold Wilson was much younger, and as you know, you write in your book, age 31, at that point the youngest cabinet minister of that century, but when younger, that real sense that he allied himself and there's a lot obviously in the Pimlott biography that we won't mention. There's obviously a lot around that 1951 resignation decision, and there is also in yours as well that kind of massive strategic moment where and in both biographies, the sense that it wasn't a kind of just a singular question of the heart or question of political beliefs. It was also a very sage and calculated political gambit that you know, allied him to the left for that moment and eventually paid dividends as well. So I'm interested in the way, because it's something that people that write about Harold Wilson, I think one of the most fascinating things when you read them is how do they, especially admirers of Harold Wilson like yourself, how do they reconcile themselves with the kind of, you know, the slightly more calculating kind of political acumen of Harold Wilson. I'm not saying that in a derogatory way at all, but it's just, it is an interesting question about what he really believes. And of course, you said at the beginning that kind of congregationalism, there's a social conservatism to him. And as Glen says there's that kind of, in his appeal terms, there's that ordinariness as well. But if you could kind of just sketch what you really think his kind of political philosophy and beliefs are. And of course, this is a question you will have seen on the front page of the paper I work for
the Times this morning. Voters are trying still to work out in some respects about Sir Keir Starmer, you know, what is his clear vision? What is it that he believes? And I won't ask you unless you want to ask it necessarily what Sir Keir Starmer's is and how that differs from Wilson's. But I think it is interesting to reflect on actually, you know, what was it that Harold Wilson really believed, and what, if you were going to say his political philosophy was, you know, how would you kind of pitch that?
Yeah, and I mean, I read with interest the Times piece, Lara, today. I mean, actually, the number of people who said they did identify what Keir stood for had actually more than doubled since September 21. But you know, so you've sometimes got to look beyond the headline, haven't you? But in terms of Harold, you see, I think this is very interesting when we speak about Harold, because Harold is quite clearly a left of centre pragmatic politician. Harold is somebody who, as I've said, has this abhorrence of high unemployment, abhorrence of racism, which is another very firm aspect of his career. Has, as well as I've said, this moral sense to his politics, which he finds very, very sustaining. But Harold was also somebody who fundamentally understood that the Labour Party can only win elections if it is attuned to what the people want at any given moment, where the people are, what are the people's priorities. And actually, if you wanted to see an example of that, it isn't actually the fact that, yes, he resigned in 1951, yes, he had the roots in the Tribunite left, but moved more towards what was, and the centre ground's a very amorphous phrase, by the way. It means different things at different times, but certainly was in the centre ground and controlled the centre ground, I'd argue, for a long time. But if you wanted the real example of Harold doing this, it's actually the early 1970s. No other party leader has lost and come back within one parliament to power. Nobody else has done that. And one of the reasons is because in that 1970 to 74 period, when even people like Dennis Healey, who's hardly identified with the left of the party, is talking about wealth taxes and making the pipsqueak and all this sort of thing, Harold really does work on the National Executive Committee through Joe Haynes, through Judith Hart and others, to try to keep policy in a sensible position so that he can become the moderate voice in 1974 when Heath is in that dispute with the trade unions and the who governs election. So that's what I think Harold Wilson is. He's left of centre, but he's a pragmatist who understands instinctively what it takes to win. The only qualifier I'd add to Glen's analysis of him is this, and I'd say to everyone on this call today, think of Harold Wilson with the HP sauce, which he was so identified with. They called it Wilson's gravy in the 60s and the 70s. His love of Agatha Christie, his love of Gilbert and Sullivan, the holidays in the Scilly Isles, the Yorkshire accent, the fact that he loved Huddersfield Town, the Ganex raincoats. You know, this was someone who was really conscious of image and was authentic Yorkshire, almost quintessentially an English figure and a provincial figure as well, by the way. But if you, and this is what I say to everyone on this call, have a look at the British Pathé footage. It's all on YouTube of the Harold Wilson of the 1940s. Have a look at Harold Wilson as the president of the Board of Trade, announcing his so-called bonfire of the controls when he reduced a lot of the wartime rationing and took it away. And he's very formal. He's got this tiny moustache. You'd never believe that very formal, very staid, very nervous figure becomes the Wilson that the novelist Kingsley Amis said, I knew him just well enough to want to go for a pint with him. And one of the reasons for that transformation is someone that we've not mentioned yet on the call, is Marcia Williams, who was working for him from 1956 onwards. And one of the many things to Harold Wilson was, she was one of the few who could actually tell him to his face when things were good and things were not. And he often used to give Marcia his speeches to read, and she was the one who'd stick a line through it, write rubbish on it and give it him back. And she used to say to him, if I can't understand it, the public can't understand it. So you need to rewrite it. And she and her influence on him in the 50s and 60s is one of the ones who really does influence him, going from that very staid academic figure to the politician who can look at the photograph, hang around with the Beatles without too much trouble in 63, 64.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, Glenn, we've obviously omitted to speak about Marcia, but of course,
Yes.
you know, we're talking a lot in Westminster and politics at the moment, especially about resignation honours and the future of the House of Lords, and as whether or not that should be you know, replaced by an elected upper chamber, whether or not that should be a first-term priority for Sir Keir Starmer or not. And of course, Harold Wilson's career in many ways was sort of is a kind of perfect arc of these questions around privilege and the House of Lords, because of course so much of his appeal at the beginning of his time at Prime Minister is of course you know, criticising his opponents, you know, disavowal of his hereditary peerage, and painting himself, as you say, as the kind of ordinary man and the ordinary opposite to that. And of course, you know, having that opposite figure as someone of great privilege. And Nick writes in his book about how, you know, all of his predecessors as Prime Minister, when they would you know, rock up to see the monarch, would certainly have been from a much more privileged background than Harold Wilson was at that moment. But of course, that kind of position he took on the House of Lords was really politically crucial. And then to leave as he did, and to have his career in many ways mired, and in some ways, you know, excessively so, by the kind of fallout from the Lavender List, which of course Marcia is intimately connected with, I think is quite a fascinating thing. And if you could reflect, I mean, I don't, you know, I think nobody would argue that there's a Marcia equivalent in the leader of the opposition's office, really, that you could think of. But that ability of somebody, you know, that has the Prime Minister's ear to be able to shape them as a politician. You know, Nick is right that Wilson is that kind of, you know, deeply academic, bureaucratic mind, who's kind of, you know, weaned on detail, and whose career is built on that in many ways, having to find a way to kind of distance himself from that, to be able to speak in some senses in primary colours. And I wonder if you think that there's a similar arc in Keir Starmer's political career. It feels like there's not necessarily, but of course his background, you know, in as DPP, and kind of, you know, working out a way to kind of relate to people. Do you think it's fair to say that he's gone enough of the way with that? And obviously, you know, Nick is right to say that when I mentioned that Times article, it's true that actually if you look into the polling, the difference that's been made in the last 18 months, when YouGov polled that obviously in September 2021, is really large. And of course, and the kind of ability of voters to be able to see a clear vision on a number of different issues from Sir Keir Starmer has apparently, according to YouGov, improved. So I wonder what you make of that, and whether or not you think that there are any lessons in that for a future election campaign.
Well, many things there. Again, how long have you got? But the first thing is that point about social class that Nick made is quite important, which is I don't think Harold ever lost the sense of being slightly déclassé and slightly lower middle class. And that's just why he doesn't get on with Gateskill, who's rather more socially grand and mixes in rather different circles. These points are really they're very hard to capture for the historian, but they're definitely there. Also, remember, he didn't serve in the Second World War. He was in a reserved occupation. So he's a statistician, and he was required, and he was much better to be serving in London. But that also cuts him off from lots of the other MPs who all know each other from the services and all, of course, respect each other. People like Crossland and Healy had a really stellar war records, and Harold also didn't have that. He really doesn't like Alec Hume, Lord Douglas Hume, for that kind of aristocratic reason. So there's a social class element there, which I think also Starmer comes from that kind of lower middle class background, doesn't he? It's not dissimilar, and state grammar, which becomes a private school later, doesn't it? But there's definitely parallels between them personally. Another thing I'd say about Wilson's leadership is that, like all successful leaders, he wears many faces. So like if Blair is like, you know, he can be, you know, millenarial speaker, he can be like young vicar, he can be like centrist, you know, hashtag centrist dad, etc. All these things that Tony can be. Harold is, you know, Dr. Harold, Science Harold, University Lecture Harold, you know, Uncle Harold, Football Harold. You know, he also is all these things, and really successful leaders do that. And I think less successful leaders get rather one-speeded, or they get rather flat-footed. And David Cameron, for instance, is a good example of someone who kind of had one mode, who kind of had, you know, and that is leaders that, and similarly to Theresa May, they don't really have more technicolor pictures of themselves. Last thing is about Marcia. Yes, I mean, when we talk about Harold's balancing act between the left and the right, he's also got a balancing act between those people who his coterie think of as his real wife and his office wife. People who he'll take anything from, and Marcia will scream at him in the office and say these things to him that in front of people that really most prime ministers that would not happen. And that is it's a little bit destabilizing, but it's also strangely helpful because prime ministers require someone to say, no, this is wrong. So Thatcher has that early on with Willie Whitelaw, and she also has it with Dennis, of course, and really ministers who just say, no, Margaret, I think that's wrong. She just says, oh, hang on, maybe they're right. And if you stand up to her, that you can really get somewhere, which is why the first part of her premiership, she's quite successful. So Harold has people who he trusts. He has a kind of gang who can say things to him, maybe drinking up in the early hours that really help him. And so he doesn't get into these bear traps that prime ministers who don't have that get into, leaders who don't have that get into. Kind of unknown prime ministers who don't have friends in politics, that's much more difficult. So Marcia, yes, it doesn't help because ministers are like, well, we want to talk to Harold. Why is she talking to him up, in the flat? But it also does help because she actually has very, very fine-tuned political antennae, just like him.
It's interesting, I suppose, Nick, one of the others that you mentioned in the book is, of course, Barbara Castle, who said that, she felt that she could be honest to him, and there were few that, seemingly had his ear in that way and could be so honest with him. But I think because I'm aware that we don't have that much longer left, I am keen to hone in on what you think the contemporary relevance of this discussion of Wilson might be. And there's a question from William Jones in the Q&A, particularly about Wilson's first manifesto and that beginning moment. And I wonder, when you were reading this book, there must have been so many moments when you're writing this book, there must have been so many moments where you felt that you wanted to get your phone out and text Keir Starmer and say, this has made me think X, this has made me think Y about so and so. In what ways has writing the book shaped your view about Labour's project now, and do you feel hopeful that any of those lessons that you feel that you imbibed from writing it will make it into the manifesto in the next election?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's been a tremendously instructive thing to do. I'd previously written books on Nye Bevan and Clem Attlee, so I'm gradually making my way towards the present day. This might be as close as I get to the present day. But I'm hoping to be very busy over the next few years, Lara. But after that, possibly
that will be too busy.
One in before 2024.
Possibly Barbara Castle, who you've mentioned, who I think is just such a tremendous figure. But yeah, you'll see and anyone who buys the book will see the person whose quote is on the front cover, and it's actually Keir Starmer himself, who I know has read the book very, very closely as well. And look, there are, I think for us at the moment, it's the 63-64 period that we are looking at so closely. That's the bit we're looking at, just as we're looking at the mid-1990s. And what we are seeking to generate, exactly what Harold did, which is the time for a change stuff, the 13 wasted years stuff, the critique of why the Tories have got things so wrong. And we're also trying to combine, in a sense, what I was talking about at the outset of my first answer, that combination of showing what we want Britain to be, together with what Wilson called the bread and butter issues, or Wilson called the issues that if he'd walked into, they used to be called working men's clubs in those days, if he'd walked into the working men's clubs as they were known at that time, what the people in there would have spoken to him about. And these are the things, exactly these things, that we are trying to draw from the way that Harold did it, and also the way that Tony Blair did in the mid-90s as well.
In the unlikely world where I advised any Labour politicians, I think there's three things which I would think about that period, 63-64. And the first is that we haven't used this phrase yet, but in the white heat, there is an elevator pitch. And I think Labour at the moment is searching for an elevator pitch. is searching for a single lozenge of a phrase that basically I can think in a post-it note that's what Labour wants. So very clearly, the white heat of the technological revolution encapsulates everything, which is we're going to nationalise, but we're going to nationalise new industries, because nationalised old industries are unpopular and declining. We're going to have lots of new universities. We're going to have comprehensive schools with a technical stream, so you're not divided at 11 or 14. Everything can come under. We're going to have much more investment in new industries like hovercraft, like Concorde, like computers, like telecommunications. So that's the first thing. So what is the elevator pitch? I think the second thing goes along with that, which is that every winner who comes to power is identified with the future. So they almost become inevitable. So Tony Blair talking about education at a time when people have begun to desperately aspire to increase their children's education is very, very important. And talking about a young country at a time when there is a younger country than there is now is very important. And Harold does that enormously powerfully, appealing to middle-class people who've just bought their house, they've married probably very early compared to us now, in their early 20s, and saying that you're being held back by Tory inefficiency, Tory incompetence. So there's also a sense of the future, and there's also perhaps what you might call thirdly and lastly, there's an X factor and an excitement around Harold that also Blair has in the mid-90s, that also Thatcher has around only when she comes into power, not so much when she's leader of the opposition. That there is a fire in his belly that is really very powerful. We think of the later Wilson when he's older, when he's out of puff a bit more, but the younger Wilson of the early 60s is really full of this zeal, which when you watch the video is actually very very exciting. Was perhaps only exciting for people like me who watch these things, but he's actually full of this kind of heat. We talk about the white heat, but he's got it as well. So what's the elevator pitch? What's the future you're imagining? And where is the passion? Is the three things I would say that he's got in spades in that period.
Interesting. And Nick, just before we close, my colleague Patrick wrote of the kind of 12 Labour slogans, potentially the 12 possible lozenges that Glen has just mentioned there. Do you think that you've alighted on one yet? And when you look at the life and the political career of Harold Wilson, is there one that pops to mind that you would hope that Keir Starmer would yield to?
Well, do you know, it's a strange thing, isn't it, when you talk about this, because when you look at the phrases and the things that we associate, both Harold Wilson and Tony Blair spoke about a new Britain, both of them. Tony Blair did put the New Labour before it, New Labour, New Britain, but the New Britain is actually what both of them did. And I think the lesson I take from both of them is what they also did. No, I agree with all that Glen has said around that passion for change. And by the way, Keir Starmer's got passion for change in spades and has throughout his career. But I think what is also fascinating is they managed to do both of them, both those things of promising change, but also reassurance. Both of them did that. And I think that's the thing as well. Reassurance, for example, on things like our commitment to NATO, our commitment to defence, our commitment to sound money, alongside promising change as well. That's the balance that Wilson and Blair got right. And I think that's the balance we have to get right again in the next 18 months.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you. We're going to have to, it's 8 o'clock, so we're going to have to close that there. Thank you so much, Glen and Nick, for joining us for that discussion tonight, which was fascinating. And thank you so much to everybody who came along too. And I'm sorry we didn't get through all of the questions. We tried to work them into the discussion as best as we could, but do feel free to email me or anyone at Progressive Britain if you have any questions about this. And the link to Nick's book is, of course, in the chat that I mentioned at the beginning. So you can grab yourself a copy of that too. Progressive Britain will be doing more of these events, so just keep an eye on the website for more of them as and when they are scheduled. And thank you so much for coming tonight. And I very much hope that people can go away and think a little bit more about Harold Wilson as we near the 2024 election, because I, for one, think he's certainly one of our most fascinating figures. So thank you and have a lovely evening.